Brittain barbecue, yes, has been going on for years, longer than 80 years, I would say. First one was right out here, built right out here, before this house was here. Probably I was 12. That would have been 1932, wasn't it? I was born in 1920, you know. But we just dug a little pit right out here, about 2 feet wide and 4 feet long. And Daddy would put some pine saplings on each side and on each end and put chicken wire on there to throw the meat on.
Just always woke up to the barbecue smoke. It was something to look forward to. Well, I knew we were fixing to have a big meal, and grandson Ethan told me just the other day, he says, you know, we have some good food on the 4th of July.
My first memories of the 4th of July barbecue at Brittain Hill, I don't remember exactly how old I was, but the smell would wake you up early in the morning. And when I say early, by 5 o'clock. That woke you up. You knew the 4th of July was here. Pa Dad would always have the meat on there early.
Very early.
And my first recollection of where it was located was back behind what is now the garage, or bunkhouse as we call it now. There was a hole in the ground where he had his fire built, and of course he had his coal fire built to the side. And what he cooked the meat on was made out of 4-post and chicken wire. And of course he had his sauce, and what he daubed his sauce on there with was just a plain old stick cut off of a tree somewhere. And the end of it was wrapped probably with a cotton sack, and he dabbed in the sauce in that and dabbed it on that meat.
We've had these 4th of Julys at different places on Brittain Hill. One of my fondest remembrances would be Uncle Jess. We used to have it on the creek, and we walked down behind Mom and Daddy's house. Uncle Jess was carrying a big pan of meat, and you had to walk across some steps over the fence. Well, the steps were not very sturdy, and when Uncle Jess got on top of that step with that pan of meat, the steps collapsed. We picked the meat up. I was quite young then. We picked the meat up, washed it off, and cooked it.
And we would dig a pit wherever you wanted to go. We went to the river a couple of times and dug the pit on early July the 4th morning, and Daddy and Uncle Jess and me and Jordan would go down and dig it and fix it and start the fire, and then everybody would come around at lunchtime and we'd eat on the banks of the river. At that time, Tom Russell, you know him. He was involved in a little bit because he bought Mr. Smith, who was Tom's father-in-law, owned that land. Uncle Frank would get the kids and throw them in the river. The first time we were at the river, I was helping build with an axe, cutting some stuff to build a frame for the wires to go over. I cut my shin off my left leg, and the scar's still there. Ouch. It hurt too.
My next recollection is behind the house to the kind of the north, back over there where he built a modern, back then, built a brick pit, and he made his, like I say, he got modern, he made his mesh, his wire out of metal. Kind of like really kind of like a little bed spring thing, but he still used his chicken wire. And there was an old stove, wood stove, that came out of the house originally, and he had that hooked up, and that's where he cooked his sauce.
He had to have oak wood, and nothing, didn't want it mixed. And he would raise Cain about it if you stirred up his fire. Daddy would. And Louise's husband, Billy Lindsay, got a piece of an old wisteria vine that was rotten and threw it in there, and Daddy just blessed him out, and I don't think Billy didn't forget that till the day he died. Because Daddy got on him for putting that old dead wisteria vine in the fire. The meat was goat, belly goat at that time. He was barbecuing billy goat. And he could buy a billy goat for 50 cents. 50 cents to $1. And he'd go buy one and bring it here to, he and Uncle Jess would execute that billy goat. And you don't want to hear a billy goat when they're executing them. You know, there were not a lot of billy goats around here. Daddy would have a hard time finding one, and we'd come right up to the deadline and say, I hadn't got a goat yet.
And I had a pet goat, and right before the 4th of July, this particular year, I do not remember the year, but right before the 4th of July, I went to visit Louise and Billy in San Antonio.
When we got back, we didn't have a pet goat anymore.
But it was the 4th of July. I can't swear that we ate Nanny, but anyway.
But Billy Lou had a goat, but I think it was, you know, she could talk to a goat. She talked, bleat just like them.
But I don't really like to think about it. Nanny was cute. even if it was eating up everything Mama had on the place growing.
I was probably about 8 or 9, and I would be in Lufkin for part of the summer, and the barbecue was going to happen. And the thing I remember the most is Bbbq bringing the goat in the trunk of his car. And the goat would be tied up in there, and I didn't really want to look at it, but I knew it was there, and it was in his old Chevrolet trunk, and they would come out and get it and take the goat down back behind the smokehouse-like area. And I never watched any of that, but then in the distance I would see the goat hanging on this stick between 2 trees. And I always kind of stood off in the distance looking at it, but I didn't want to get too close.
That's an awful sound.
Remember the last goat that we had? Daddy let Bbbq, Dixon, and Joe Brown clean the goat this year. That was the last goat we ever cooked. Daddy said it had too much hair on it.
We had hairy goat meat for that meal.
That kind of ended the goat cooking. Another memory, and I don't know how come Aunt Esther and them there on the 4th of July, but James was always picking at me, James Jones. And back then, a lawn chair was nothing but a piece of canvas on a wooden base that you put the sticks in to prop it up. James comes along and he flips that thing up so my chair collapses. And when he flipped that chair, Aunt Esther and Mama both got on him.
Did anybody laugh?
James.
My earliest recollections of the Brittain Hill 4th of July would have been sitting around the fire pit and the cook stove at Brittain Hill when we kept the sauce warm on an old wood stove, an old wood burning stove that they had out back. And of course I remember all of the uncles that would come around and stoke the fire and sop the meat and tell stories.
I remember
folks gathered around that pit, you know, shooting the breeze, cooking. I was small back then on the hill, and us younger kids, I guess, would just horse around and play while the adults cooked. I remember the pit was back behind the house, just out beside the old shed that was behind the house, which the shed was part old smokehouse and part chicken coop, as I recall. It seems like half of it was on one half. The south half was a chicken coop. The north half was the smokehouse, and I remember going in there, and the smokehouse part, you know, you could still smell the smoke permeating the wood stuff in there.
I remember the Brittain 4th of July being at Brittain Hill, and I guess the picture I get in my mind is of the food table. It was always set up at the end of the porch, and the meat was in the big white enamel bowl. I remember that after lunch, the men always stretched out in those Chase Lounge woven lawn chairs under the trees and took a nap.
The food was always good. Certain people were known for certain things, and there was, you know, Coke salad that Tutta always made and was always there. That was a staple. And
we had cantaloupe, tomatoes, corn on the cob, good food, home cooked food, homegrown and raised food from our garden.
Mama always brought one bowl of potato salad, and she fixed it different than what we make potato salad now. She used onion and vinegar. And we always had lots of sliced tomatoes.
There was always a lot of watermelon. Always got a big kick out of that.
There were always lots of desserts. More desserts than other food sometimes.
Just most any dessert's good.
the homemade mustard-based barbecue sauce is legendary.
That has been a family quote-unquote secret, because it's not your typical tomato-based red sauce. It's basically mustard and vinegar. But I better not say that very loud, because Joyce wanted to keep it a secret forever. She didn't want to share it very much with anybody.
Making the sauce, he never measured anything. He just poured it all together. I don't know where he got it, I don't know.
Most of the time it was family, but there were also lots of hay balers that ate 4th of July. Like Otto and the Carl Morgans and Stevensons and whoever Jordan had on the hay baling crew.
In the most recent decades, I would say Joe Ed was the one who gave the blessing always, but I can certainly remember when Pa Dad did the blessing.
We would go pretty much every year, and there was a routine. Paul Root would come over early and then start a fire, and I would try to get up early enough and be out there so I wouldn't be the last one there.
I was never ready to wake up when company came at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Everybody would sit around, Jody would come, the Brittain boys would come, everybody would eventually get there, and Joe Ed would come, and Joe Ed would come, and it was kind of a running joke. Criticized Paul for the way the fire was started.
I remember the big pot of sauce always sitting on the stove, and we'd have to stir it every so often. And of course, Meemaw was always in a tizzy, trying to make sure everything was perfect. None of us were doing it right. It was always my job to clean the back porch where the cats lived, which was pretty gross.
But then the conversation would always kind of turn back to Lufkin and what's going on in Lufkin, and I was always amazed at Paul about how much he knows about Lufkin.
Well, there's lots of good to say about Paul. He's a good old guy. Kind of quietly took care of a lot of things around there.
They have a wonderful breakfast. Meemaw and Joanne and the girls would, there'd be those Renfro sausages and eggs, and just a wonderful time by itself. And then Meemaw would like for me to set up, after that, Meemaw would want me to set up the shelters because it would almost always rain. And I was never very apt at doing that, but I was amazed at Jody. Jody could just intuitively come and look at everything and put it together.
Most of the 4th of Julys I attended were at Meemaw's house, and only very recently did we move the 4th of July celebration to Hudson. And at Meemaw's, I always remember just swimming in the pool. I always remember there was always a lot of food, a lot of tents. There was a ton of people that came also.
The majority of my time of 4th of July, despite eating, was spent in the pool with cousins, jumping off the diving board, playing like mermaids and stuff like that. Just spending all day in the pool until usually it rained and we'd have to get out.
All the men in the family would get up really early to go over there and cook. I never did though. I also remember there was this swing set over there that we'd always play on. I'm pretty sure we broke it one year or it rotted or something, but we eventually stopped playing on it.
And I remember a lot of the times since all of my mom's siblings were home, we were stuck in the camper for sleeping arrangements, which was actually kind of fun, but it was also really cold in there. I liked the tomato pie. There were always lots of desserts, and I probably got one of every dessert that there was.
Cakes were always good.
There's always a lot of casseroles and things of that sort. Some people would call it old people food, but and there's always lots of good chicken, lots of good meat, chicken, a little bit of beef.
I remember that we always sang "God Bless America" before we ate, which was really special to me, and I really appreciated that.
One of the other things we've done since it's kind of evolved over the years is we've begun to do a little firework display, and Jay and Jordan have sort of spearheaded that, and each year they've always made sure we had plenty of fireworks to go, and now that we've got the younger kids, they all like those things, and we're even beginning now to add a water slide for these third generations.
The fireworks were always my favorite part. We always held them in Hudson. We never had them at Meemaw's. We'd always go to Meemaw's for lunch and hang out there during the day, and everyone would go home and then reconvene at Hudson to shoot off fireworks.
The reason this 4th of July celebration has happened so long is because our daddy, Paw-Dad, instilled in us family. And we got along and we had a good time. And even after Paw-Dad passed away, we still had our 4th of July. That's just been a family tradition since the beginning of my time. We've had it. I cannot remember a year we ever missed having the 4th of July.
I think the tradition has just continued for 80 years or however many years it's been, because it's a great gathering. It's once a year. And the tradition started with family and lots of good food, and once it got started, it was looked forward to every year.
And now we're most gracious that our nephews, the Brittain boys, have continued the tradition, and it's still great.
Oh, you didn't have to say that. You're not I'm not paying you.
Kind of like a special holiday.
I think the 4th of July kind of helped keep the family together, and so it kind of goes both ways.
Just hope it continues. And I believe my Brittain nephews said as long as they're around, there will be a 4th of July.
I think the tradition has lived on because the generation before us instilled in us that it was very, very important to them and for us to keep it going.
I think it was just a good opportunity every year for everyone to mark their calendar and make it a priority to see family.
It was always a big deal, and Daddy always ready to go with it every 4th of July.
If you had to come up with one word to describe the 4th of July celebration, the cooking out, what would that one word be?
camaraderie.
It's a good word. A lot of syllables.
I can't spell it.